and we're aiming to sort of start fairly promptly. I think it's always worth giving a couple of minutes. Our first speaker, Rob, is triple book tonight with, I suspect, the football and an event at his college that he's sort of having to sneak away from. So we'll just give a minute or so to see if Rob can join us, and if he can't, I'll open the batting and then pass over to Maeve, and we'll see if Rob can get here at all. And also, if I start and Dr. Russell appears, I will stop my talk and then we'll let Dr. Russell speak, and then I'll come back and finish my slides. So we'll just give him one more minute and then we'll get going. I'd ask everybody, if you have comments to make, please feel free to place them in the chat area. They'll be monitored by the team in the UMS office. So if you ask questions via the chat, then we'll come back to you. We'll either ask your question on your behalf, or we'll come back to you and let you enable your camera, enable your microphone, and let you ask the question in person. Okay, that's 3 minutes past, so there's no sign of Dr. Russell just yet. So I'm going to just share my screen. And so this is a short presentation, which is a summary of some of the information that were collected during the last year from all the sections and boards within UMS. And so we sent an email to all UMS bodies with a structured questionnaire, and then a follow-up reminder in May and another one in January of this year. And then the team in the office assembled the replies, built them into a spreadsheet, and then the results in this have been produced from that spreadsheet. So this was the message that went off and went out from the three chairs of the three groupings, and these were the replies. So we had 38 replies from 36 UMS bodies, of whom 32 had exams. Group 1 is for those who aren't familiar with UMS, is all the medical specialties. Group 2 are the surgical specialties, and Group 3 are a mixture of the other specialties that don't quite fall into medical or surgical. And so of those who replied and had an exam, 6 of these exams were wholly within the UMS, run by the UMS itself. 17 were run by the European Specialty Society with support from UMS, and there were 5 other exams that were not within UMS. So I asked about the corporate partners, and the reason why I asked about this is as people move from, or may move from face-to-face exams, where the exams take place where everything is in person, into the multiple choice question or written papers, I thought it would be useful to see what corporate partners were being used. Pearson VUE is an international exam taking organisation which in the UK does the driving test, the theory test for driving, and also the FRCS exams. The written papers are run through the Pearson VUE. So there are 4 UMS bodies who use them for their MCQ questions, and they're centres with computers where you go to, you have to go in with no paper or pens, and you leave in the same context. Orzone is a Swedish company, and it was a corporate partner for 2 exams. They support both MCQ exams and also clinicals. One exam was run through a local agency in Warsaw. One exam was run through a company called Cognitus, and one used Ledholo. In terms of the format of the exams, you can see that even during the COVID era, 17 of the exams were live, both MCQs and clinicals. 7 moved to online. 4 had both the clinical examination and questions and the MCQs online. And 1 had both the written paper and the clinical paper hybrid, with both online and live participants. 19 exams were postponed. 11 exams were moved to online only, and 1 was moved from live to hybrid. None of the UMS bodies or partners had any insurance, so some organisations suffered a considerable loss. The interesting thing was feedback was very positive from those who had moved from being live to hybrid. They found that the exams were more economical to run because there weren't expenses for both candidates and faculty. And there were more than the usual number of candidates for some of the exams, I think again because candidates didn't have to travel. But the disadvantages are significant. That's fear of the unknown, the risk of technical problems, and then the faculty, not getting the faculty together, and I guess the risk of the exam being compromised by online problems. So I think as far as UMS views the future, I think that there's a potential to make bigger deals across boards with the corporate partners to get a better value for money. There have been a few incidents in the past, both at conferences, meetings and exams, where there have been difficulties with the corporate partner for that exam. And I guess the bigger the contract, the more support from the UMS office, the less likely there is for that, for an unfavourable contract to be signed. There's also the portfolio of information available at the UMS office so that people get a good deal if a good deal is to be had, and that would support hybrid exams. And I think that is at the core, is accepting that some of the information for these exams is sensitive commercially. I think within UMS we are one organisation, and if that was shared across organisations within UMS, across boards, I think we're more likely to get a good deal, save money and have adequate support from our corporate partner. So that's my short talk. I don't see Ross's name on, or Dr. Rob's name on the list. So he may have been waylaid still. So if possible, then I'll hand over to Maeve from SESMA, who is going to talk about and SESMA, for those who are new to UMS, is the organisation within UMS that maintains standards within the exam system. So I'll hand over to Dr. Durkin to talk about SESMA in this context.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Patrick, for the invitation to speak and be part of the webinar. It's a great privilege. I'm here speaking on behalf really of the executive from US SESMA, and SESMA was very much appointed by UMS with a view to recommendations on setting up exams and exam structures. And our president is Dr. Mark Westwood. He has been delayed chairing another meeting and hopefully will join us shortly. And I hope you'll enjoy my presentation, as I said, on behalf of and representative of the fruits of a very successful collaboration of a very good XCOM team. So I want to give you a sense of the update as to what SESMA is doing and feedback with regard to exams. And SESMA has been very much tasked with providing guidance for setting up an exam if you are a novice in setting up an exam, and also with regard to guidance if you want to either update your exam, amend your exam, or expand your exam. I have to say my ascension, if you like, to SESMA was on foot of being appointed to the working group for our exam from the European Board of Endocrinology. Our president at that time tasked us with setting up a European board exam in endocrinology. And I have to say that our working group that was made up of 3 had absolutely no idea how to approach this. So we were sent to SESMA with a view to learning how to set up an exam, how to select an exam to suit us, and what was the best and how to progress that, being cognizant of costs, logistics, and clearly the number of people that would be needed. So the update I'm going to give you is certainly with regard to the experiences as SESMA has certainly evolved in the session of Mark Westwood and I, having taken on the role of chair and vice chair in the last 3 to 4 years. It's been a steep learning curve in terms of us focusing on actually structuring an exam. And our meetings tend to run twice a year. Pre-COVID they did. And on day 1, we always have an extensive working shop. And those working shops focus on aspects of exam development and exam delivery. And I'll give you a sense of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm really going to present this talk more on foot of the questions that we need to ask ourselves before embarking on setting up an exam. And maybe if you have an exam already set up, the questions you might ask as to whether you need to improve it. Are there concerns about security? Do you want to progress that from a 1-part to a 2-part or a 3-part? And similarly, we had our annual assembly meeting on Zoom. We had 88, I think, attendees, and that was held just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it was with a view to what are we going to do in the times of the COVID era? Do we change things? How do we change them? How do we envision exams? Are we going to go back to the pre-COVID exam delivery? And I'll give you again a sense of the returning answers as to how people want to progress. I'm not going to talk about an exam appraisal today. That's very much another core part of SESMA. And that's essentially providing an appraisal of the process of your exam, the process of delivering it, such as creating question banks, and then the process of how you've determined your pass mark. And so we can guide people early on in terms of a formative appraisal, or at the end of final exam delivery, what we call a summative appraisal. So the question that you want to ask to your section is, what kind of exam are you envisaging? Are you looking at a pure MCQ? Are you looking at an OSCE clinical exam? Are you looking at an oral exam? If it's radiology, maybe you're just looking at, a clinical history in terms of assessing films. When you're going to set up an exam, you've got to determine how many candidates. Are you a smaller specialty? You might only have 10 candidates, in which case, if you want to do an OSCE or an oral exam, that might be something that would blend very well, giving you a good assessment not only of knowledge, but of competency. Or if you have 300 or 400 candidates, maybe if you're setting up an exam, you have to look at something that will be easier to deliver as a first off platform. And therefore you might look at something like an MCQ exam. You might be very ambitious like we were and say, we want the best, we want a 3-part exam, but you've got to look at what you can deliver. And sometimes you just have to walk before you can run. So you might say that part of your assessment demands 2 or 3 parts, as in an MCQ, a written, a clinical, or a practical. But maybe as a start, you might say, look, I'll just run with an MCQ. Running exams and delivering exams is expensive. You need a lot of money at the beginning to be able to do that. One would expect on a time frame that after 3 to 4 years you will break even, and so the cost of the exam will be met by the cost of the candidates. But you have to accept that the cost of delivering that exam initially has to be borne by you as a section, and so therefore your initial exam structure will have to be contingent on that. We've already had if you like, a comment with regard to whom are you going to partner with? So you may have professional partners for delivery of your exam, but on the other side, you may need to look at academic partners. So when we were setting up our European Board of Exam and Endocrinology, we felt that as a group or an assembly alone, that might be more difficult to deliver in terms of a proper time frame within a 2 to 3 year time frame, having high quality exam and high quality structure. So we looked at partners to be able to do that. And so you need to look at your partners and different academic institutions and your potentially your partnering specialist society. So when you're looking at that exam, you want to say, okay, am I going to have, in terms of a written exam, an MCQ only? Maybe you might say, I'm going to do a written exam, which is an essay exam. We've had a lot of discussions and presentations from our neurology colleagues in the Netherlands with open book exams, and these are certainly gaining traction. And indeed, it's interesting to see how open book exams have become part of the format of some of the universities adapting to COVID and having now to deliver an examination. I've seen it firsthand, interestingly, in Ireland, not clearly in subspecialty exams yet, and I've seen it in the Netherlands. So it's a very, very interesting concept that is really gaining, as I said, a lot of momentum. And obviously the oral exams, in terms of how are you going to deliver face-to-face, there's the necessity for many people to deliver that oral exam. You're going to have at least 2 examiners. And then obviously OSCE exams, logistics of delivery, numbers of people, numbers of candidates, and the time that that's going to demand. So when we look at the exam, and you've got to say what exam fits you best, and you may decide, okay, I'm going to go with an MCQ. You may decide for a smaller field, smaller number of candidates, a written exam or an open book exam may suit you. And then clearly the delivery of the oral exam has a lot of challenges. When you look at MCQs, and we do a lot of workshops on the MCQs, you can have single best answer. We can look at extended matching, and we run a course on how to do that, because you might think that writing a question is very simple, and actually it turns out to be very complex. You've got to decide with your MCQ, again, pre-COVID, will that be paper-based? Will it be online? If it's online, will you do it with a particular provider? Will that online exam be done in a particular time frame? And again, pre-COVID, you might run a lot of those exams in conjunction with a lot of the meetings. If you're looking at the oral exams, it's absolutely essential, and that you're going to have a minimum of 2 examiners, probably so that one does not take over from the other, also so that we can take away from the hawk and dove effect. And it's very important that as you're delivering that oral exam, you can't just have an ad hoc, well, tell me what you think about this. There really needs to be predetermined questioning within the oral exam, so there's a consistency in the delivery across each candidate. So if you have 300 candidates and you want to deliver an oral exam for 300 candidates, you're probably looking at least 100 examiners. And if you're looking at 50 rolling each time with 300 candidates, you may be looking at 2 or 3 days. So these are the questions you've got to ask yourself in terms of how you're going to deliver, whether you do that face-to-face or whether you're going to move to that as an online delivery in, again, the context of the COVID. So when we look at the exam delivery, we have to factor in cost. You have to factor in security, and security certainly has become much more of an issue as we've moved to the online exam. So, for example, traditionally, when we would have delivered the endocrine exam, we would have done it in partnership with the Federation. We would have done it with Pearson VUE. You went into a particular Pearson VUE station, tremendous security there, but it was online and it was through a computer that was there. Now, with COVID and restrictions, you can't do that. So you're looking at a lot of online exams at home, but within that, you have to have a security factored in that you can see the candidate, that you have intermittent contact, that you can look at the room. So the delivery of that will mandate now not only a good provider for your online system, but probably you maybe need to subcontract that on-time delivery to a security delivery group as well. And again, within that, we're looking at a lot of manpower. And so our workshops, as I said, will alternate around MCQ, styles of MCQ. We talk about written exams and styles of exams, and then we talk about oral examinations and the styles of that and the prerequisite, particularly if you want to have papers, as in a published paper ahead of it. So when you run an exam, you've got to say, well, what am I testing? What do I want to find out from this candidate? Because the different exam modalities will deliver different aspects. And you might make an assumption that the candidate sits the exam and passes, and so that determines competency, but it doesn't. If you run an MCQ exam, you're hoping within your MCQ that there'll be some rationale and reasoning and thinking, and that's part of the whole extended matching question potentially. But really within the MCQ, if you just deliver an MCQ exam, on its own, it may well only be an assessment of knowledge. So an assessment of knowledge is very different to an assessment of competency. So if you look at the very well stylized orthopedic and anesthetic exams, which are running now for 30 years, there are 3 parts. There's MCQ, there's written, there's a clinical assessment and OSCE. You know that across the breadth of that delivery, you are not only assessing knowledge, but you're assessing competency. And so really, when you're looking at potentially an MCQ, that might be fine. But if it's a one-stage exam and you're just doing an MCQ, and I would say in endocrinology, our exam on its own in endocrinology assesses knowledge, but it is not a determination of competency. And so therefore, if you want to set your exam depending on that, you will want to look at that in terms of training. So if I just say anybody can sit the MCQ exam and they pass the exam, that's a determination of knowledge. If I say that you can sit that exam when you have completed training, you have certified training, you are signed in your training as having completed accredited training, and then you sit an exam, the alignment of both of those may give more of a sense of assessment of knowledge and competency because they're both aligned. And so that's where you want to be careful about who is going to take your exam. So are you going to have somebody take the exam at year 2 of a 5-year training, or is it going to be at year 5? So at year 2 of training, that may be helpful in your training program. We would call that a formative exam assessment. And that'll help to tell you how your trainee is doing and where they're weak. And then you can slot them into training aspects where they are poor. And that's certainly in the United States where I had trained, we would do those exams to be able to delineate where we were weak for training. We would take summative exams at the end of our training program, but that was aligned with the curriculum, aligned with training, at training with an assumption of a knowledge basis. And so that when you set the exam, that exam determined competency. So within that, you've got to decide, are your candidates going to be in Europe, where we are hoping to harmonize pan-European training, a similar platform, similar, if you like, knowledge base, similar training. So therefore, when all your candidates take the exam, you would expect the results to be similar. But if you have patients at different levels of if you have candidates at different levels of training, that may just create discrepancies in how many pass and how many fail, and that may create a discrepancy in your final pass mark and how you determine the pass mark. And so if you open it up abroad, that may influence your determination of your pass mark. So if you're going to structure an exam and you're going to set up an exam, regardless of whether you've got a 1-part, 2-part, or 3-part, you're going to need questions. You're going to need standard setting to know that those questions are good and they're examining a good candidate. And within those questions, you may have discriminating questions that will help to tier out maybe not just the minimally passing candidate. And so within this, as was our experience, you are going to have a question writing group. And you're going to have people who are going to be ready to meet, to design questions, and those questions have got to be put into a question bank. Minimally, you need a question bank of 2 to 3 questions if you're running an MCQ. The question bank has to be updated because as soon as you use those questions, you need to add in other questions, but you may maintain those questions for 3 to 5 years later. And so there has to be turnover. And if you enter into a partnership with an academic institution and you've decided that you're going to share that exam, you may want to determine, well, if I as a European board contribute a question, will I own that question if you like, if the marriage breaks down or the partnership falters? So those are things that need to be set in stone. And so within your question writing group, that'll go to the standard setting group to make sure that the standard meets certain minimum criteria of assessment, that those questions are discriminatory. And that then leads to determining your exam pass mark. So you can't just say, well, I'll set the pass mark at 60% or I'll set it at 70%. You've got to say who's taking the exam. You've got to assume a certain minimum length of training and knowledge, and that there's a harmonization with that, and everybody has reached a certain level of standard. Because if you've somebody taking an exam at year 2 and year 5, there's going to be a complete skew in who's going to pass and who's going to fail, and that may skew your results. And so the experiences and training level have got to influence whom you are going to decide is eligible to take the exam. And so when you're going to sit down and determine your pass mark well ahead of setting the exam, you've got to say, what scoring system am I going to use? Will I use an Angoff score for the minimally passing candidate, or you can have a modified score of that? Will you look the Hofsey method or the Cohen method? So there are different methods, and those methods may vary according to the style of your exam, the structure of your exam, and what you're looking to assess. So how will we deliver the exam? And this is, we've got to determine that pre and post-COVID. Are you going to deliver it online? And certainly with the MCQs, we no longer have the ability, like hitherto, we would have introduced various providers. Hitherto, we might have had the candidates attend their scientific congress and they'll sit their exam, but they'll do it online in terms of being provided with computers, and there's a security within the computer. So you have a provider and you need to know that that provider is stable in terms of that the exam is not going to break down halfway through, that they're on site to provide that backup. Clearly, we no longer have that, and everything is moving online. So you need to know that your provider can actually assess and contain an online format with multiple numbers of people across different countries online at the same time. And so if one person is having a break, that they can do that, a break in terms of transmission. And again, your online provider may not necessarily have the expertise in the security backup for how that exam is delivered at the time. A lot of the providers will have security in terms of holding the data, holding your questions. And so we've had a couple of presentations, and I'm hoping Ross will make it, where they had 2 providers for their exam. They had the provider for the online delivery, but the provider subcontracted to a security provider to make sure that the security of that was absolutely robust. And there's no doubt that if you have an online exam versus an on-site exam, it is cheaper. It is cheaper to run. It is cheaper to do. Rather than bringing multiple numbers of people into certain areas, it's certainly cheaper for the candidate. And that, if you like, leads into the delivery of oral exams, OSCE exams, that traditionally, if they're going to be on site, you've got to try and match them maybe with your international scientific meeting. It minimizes the cost for the candidates, but it also minimizes the cost for the examiner who is going to be attending at that time. So what do you do when it all goes wrong? And I suppose we've probably had a little bit more experience, and in our last 3 SESMA meetings that we've been running every 6 months, we have invited our delegates to actually present the flip side. So we will say, how did your exam go? What did you do? How did you deal with the restrictions of the pandemic? Did you cancel your exam, or what was your default? And what we've asked them is to say, what has happened when it's gone wrong? How did you deal with it? And that doesn't mean that we have an answer, but if we don't talk about it, we can't arrive at an answer or arrive at generating positive discussion as to how to avoid it or how to deal with it. So if you have an online delivery failure, so we had one UEMS group, they delivered the exam, there was a failure halfway through, 4 or 5 candidates could no longer access, and we were approached as CESMA as to how would we recommend to solve that. So eventually it was agreed that the exam was redelivered within 3 to 5 days to the candidates. And because of the delivery and the questions and the rotation, we felt that that was relatively safe. We had another catastrophic event with another group where it just completely broke down and the exam had to be cancelled. So we need to have a plan as what do you do and where is the backup. Security and cheating is a major issue. And, you know, if you go online, you could find 250 ways to cheat. And indeed, Professor Giamba Battista made a fantastic presentation at our last meeting about every which way to cheat. I was thinking I wouldn't be able for all of this, but everybody will find a way. And so within the protocol of your exam, you're probably going to have within the protocol of the candidate what you will do with the cheating candidate, what you will do if the exam fails, that at least from a medical legal perspective, you have some level of backup, and maybe that will be protocoled into the document. And that's certainly what we're doing in advising at CESMA at the moment. But with the cheating candidate, again, that's difficult because it's difficult in finding the cheating candidate. But if you find the cheating candidate, or should I say the candidate that's less than honest, having a pathway of how to deal with that. And it sounds obvious, but it's not. And this is going to become more of a challenge if we move more to these online deliveries. And then finally, what do you do with the candidate who challenges the results? They'll say, you know, I wasn't happy with the delivery of the exam. I felt I gave a good exam, particularly in terms of an oral or an OSCE. That's why you get to be quite rigorous about the dove, the hawk, the balance. There's no conflict of interest. The candidate is not being examined by somebody he or she is rotated with, that the exam questions are consistent. So it is making sure to avoid that potential, but also what are you going to do with the candidate who challenges the result? What is your default? So we've had a lot of discussion about how to deliver an exam, how to create an exam, how to look at your robust exam. And I suppose whether we are in COVID times or not, we want to deliver an exam. We want to adjust and we have to adapt to that. But we've also got to say to ourselves, what is our priority with this exam delivery, be it in COVID or non-COVID? And is it just a question of, listen, we've just got to deliver an exam, and will we deliver any exam? And we are subject to the pressure of our candidates who require an exam that will determine career progression. And that's very, very obvious in some countries. But we've also got to be careful that as our priorities shift in terms of the necessity of delivering an exam, in having to accept the challenge of delivery in COVID, but we must make sure to still be very thorough about the rigor of the exam development. And that's making sure you have the rigor of your question writers meeting together, and so that you do not compromise the validity and reliability of that exam. So we had been partnered with, or were partnered with, the Federation. We could not meet personally as a question writing group. We would meet every year. So we had a Zoom meeting that was all day, pre-submitted our questions, and we all went through these questions together. So that is important to have that commitment. So even though we have to compromise, we must not compromise in the exam that we would deliver, whether it was going to be pre-COVID or not. And we must not lose the art of the exam in the pursuit of the delivery of the exam. Now, to a certain extent, we probably are less compromised with an MCQ. But where the compromise may appear is going to be with an oral or OSCE exam. And I had a lovely email from Dr. Jorge Minero, who is really has been very emphatic and very involved in the orthopedic exam. And he said, I want to update you that we are running our exams. They have a 3-part exam, and we will be running a clinical-based exam with our trainees, somewhat hybrid, but we are going to be delivering that on site. So I have to say that is brave. That is huge logistical challenges. They certainly have 30 years of experience, but it's just important that when an exam and the integrity of the exam and the competency assessment of the candidate, not knowledge assessment, but a competency assessment, is very determined by the oral examination or the interactive base, we need to be very careful that in pursuing the delivery of that we cannot completely compromise and do it online. So in COVID times, no matter what, we need a high quality exam. It needs to be well validated. So you will always need a minimum number of questions, a minimum time frame, because that will give you a well validated exam result that will demand appropriate planning, and probably more planning now in the COVID era. And just to remind you that no matter what, the question writing, delivery, and the scoring are integral to that. So if we look at our survey, and we had 29 respondents, most of them the head and presidents of the UEMS boards and sections, as well as the MJCs. I have to say this was 38 until I submitted rather late. And we had survey respondents for 34 examinations at that time. And it's interesting that 14 of the 34 examinations are 1 part only, and that's predominantly MCQ, and 20 of those 34 examinations are minimally a 2-part, if not 3-part exam, which entails oral or OSCE examinations. Only 2 exams or oral examinations only. I don't know which sections those are, but I would surmise they are probably smaller sections, because that can allow for something that here will deliver knowledge and a competency assessment. And of the respondents, 3 had not yet organized an exam. So when we looked at that, approximately a third, or just over a third, were MCQ or 1-part exam. And so in a way, the challenges of COVID are probably less impressive in the delivery of MCQ, and your delivery here is going to be more on having a good provider and a good security provider. But just under 2/3 are a 2-part exam. And so that's really important, because you want to ask that exam group, you're compromised now. How do you foresee delivery with your 2 or 3-part exam? And are you going to look and try and do this like a Zoom exam in terms of the OSCE or not? And so when we looked and asked questions, if your exam is in 1 or 2 parts, how do you envisage the future? How do you envisage the future when we get past COVID? So for those who have a 1-part exam, predominantly MCQ, interestingly, 11 of those respondents were absolutely emphatic. They're going to go fully online. It's easier. It's cheaper. If you have a good provider and a security provider, it takes away a lot. And so probably going forward in the long term, this is going to be a much more manageable delivery system. Only 1 of the respondents said that they want to continue to deliver that on site and revert to on site. And the remaining 9 respondents were kind of mixed in how they looked at it. So I was just taking the extreme simply because of where the numbers lie, to give you a perspective on that. So if your exam was in 1 or 2 parts, I think I'm probably, so if you were in 2 parts, what were you going to do? So if you're a 1-part exam, it was fully online. But if you have a 2-part exam, part 1 might be MCQ. So our respondents for the 2 or 3-part exam would say, okay, for part 1, we'll do that fully online. But for part 2 or part 3, look at that. 13 out of 20 said, we want to revert to on-site delivery. So I thought that was interesting in terms of, yes, we'll deal with COVID. Yes, we'll do what we need to do. But is this going to be somewhere we will move? Definitely. It would not appear to be that way with the majority of the correspondence. So two-thirds of people of the extended exam, at least 18 at 38, would foresee a hybrid model. And the hybrid model being part 1 online, part 2 on site. And on the oral exam, they will conduct that via something like Zoom, but the preference will be to go back to a face-to-face examination for the oral delivery. Okay, I hope I haven't exhausted my time. Thank you for the opportunity to present on behalf of our group. Thank you to UEMS for entrusting us with this task, which we always hope to deliver. I invite all of you who are not familiar with this to please attend our meetings. And as I said, when we're even online, we are delivering these workshops, and certainly a lot of the online meetings have been a little bit more constricted in terms of 3 or 4 hour deliveries, longer than expected, reflecting the huge amount of discourse generated, but I think also important in guiding our own delegates. Thank you, Patrick. I'll stop now.
Thanks very much. Now, I see that Dr. Russell hasn't been able to join us. So I think we are running a little bit over. So what I was going to do, if everybody doesn't mind, is I was just going to show briefly Dr. Russell's slides, because there's a few useful points, I think, in that. And then we'll come for a discussion at the end.
Patrick, he actually presented this at SESMA, so if there's any question or concern about one of the slides that's not clear, I'd be happy to help to clarify that.
Super. Well,
I'll stay quiet, but ask if you need.
Great. Hopefully it might just come to some questions at the end. So obviously I'm not Dr. Russell. It was always going to be quite a tight one for him to join us tonight, because he had quite a lot of commitments and he clearly just hasn't managed to get out of them. And so he was going to present on his paediatric specialty exams and how they ran in the last 2 rounds. So it's quite a large exam, and you can see that it was looking to target knowledge, competence and experience, along with aptitude and communication. And so the platform that they were using, which is CYIM, is already internet based, but as Maeve mentioned, as well as invigilating in person, they used an online proctoring service, which is a system that uses a computer to monitor, well, a combination of computers and also online invigilators to monitor what the candidates are doing, to see if they're focusing on the computer or if it looks like they're looking elsewhere, reading in other places. And they did this because they wanted to run their exams in spite of COVID. And so ProctorU was the online invigilation that they used. And I think on balance, they found it was useful. And because the candidates are reviewed, it's a bit like VAR in the football. Not only does the referee get to make a decision, but you have an option for the panels to review it in the context of a red, amber, green traffic light system. So the issues with candidate identification when it's not face-to-face is done with a pre-registration check, and that's one-on-one with them presenting identification details, usually a passport or other similar photo ID. On the second of their exams, by insisting that everybody had effectively a practice run by linking in and making sure that their hardware and their broadband worked, I think almost eliminated their problems with the second sitting of their exam. They thought the remote proctoring worked, although there were some issues with it. They felt on balance that was worth the additional cost and effort. And these were their overall impressions, and you can see it's consistent with what I said from the feedback from the boards and sections that ran exams last year, and with what Dr. Durkin said, and so that there are definitely positives and negatives. And I think the less that you can put the technical side at risk by having a thorough practice beforehand, and the more reassurance you gain from running the exam successfully to reduce the anxiety about security, I think that can work well. So now we'll already see there's some hands raised. So just before we'll open the discussion to people online, I just thought it would be worth just giving a very brief overview about why. Well, I didn't mention who I was at the start. So I'm just one of the chairs of the group, chair of group 2, the surgical group. And I was asked to put this short webinar together because I thought it's worth sharing experience, particularly in these very abnormal times. I thought it would be worth helping everybody learn from everybody else's positives and negatives. And there's a range of exams across the UEMS family. Some exams are very large numbers and used as the official exam for finishing training in some nations. And other exams are very, very small, bespoke exams with sometimes less than 20 candidates looking at a particular aspect of the exam. Usually they're based on the European training requirements as the curriculum, and they range from ones, as I mentioned right at the start with my presentation, ones that are purely UMS, ones that are run as a partnership between UMS and the European Scientific Society, and some other exams that are more indirectly linked to UMS. So I think it'll be fine now because we are running just a smidgen later than planned to open up to questions. So if you either raise your hand, and I can see Vasilius already has his hand raised, and Arthur Felici had his hand raised first, but I might take chair's prerogative and let Vasilius speak first, and then we'll go to Professor Felici.
Could I ask you to unmute Mark Westwood? He's just joined us in case he has anything to answer, and it's not just me.
No, I think, I mean, you gave an excellent presentation, and I do apologise for being late. I think let's hear the comments from others, and then I'll interject as necessary.
So could we unmute Vasilius?
I'm unmuted, I think. You can hear me?
All right, super. Yep.
So, first of all, a very warm welcome to everybody to the webinar on behalf of the UEMS. I'm Vasilios Papalois. I'm the president of the UEMS. And many thanks to Patrick and the team for putting the webinar together. As Patrick said, the purpose of this webinar is for the UEMS to open a dialogue about our exams and about our assessments with the broader community, scientific community in Europe. Because we believe that this is a project that is initiated and is led by the UEMS, but it belongs to all European doctors, and we want to have this open dialogue. The second point to make is that SESMA was set up quite a few years ago. I was in the initial meeting of SESMA in a teeny tiny room in a hotel in Brussels. The first aim of SESMA was, first of all, to allow to UEMS boards to talk with each other and exchange experience. And this was fantastically achieved. The second aim was to ensure quality assurance of the UEMS assessments over a period of time. And this has also been achieved and is ever evolving. And the third, and this is where the leadership of Mark and me came into play, is to produce a series of guidelines as to how to set and develop those exams in the 21st century in a constant dialogue with the UEMS and the broader European community. So the webinar comes into this exact moment where we want this dialogue to be even stronger and even broader, especially in the context of a very, very challenging pandemic. So to come to a very specific question, and I'm delighted that Mark and Mev are on the line at the moment, is that I believe personally that the virtual world is here to stay. I don't think that once the pandemic is over, the world will go back to whatever we were doing before. And it is also certain, I think this is the consensus, that what we need is a certain balance between the old world, if we can call it this way, the live, the face-to-face interaction, and the virtual world. What do you think are the ingredients you need to put in place to make sure that we will get the balance right for the future? Mark or me, Maeve, or...
I might let Mark take that if that's okay. I think I've spoken enough. Nobody wants to hear me anymore. I think Mark and I are similar in the way we think. Anyway.
Yeah, Vasilios, that's an excellent place to start. I would completely agree. The world of hybrid virtual exams is here, and it's not going to go away. And we can debate that until Christmas, but it's not going to go away. And it's not going to go away quite simply because the world of medicine is only one aspect of the world of examinations in the very widest context, and universities and other major providers of qualifications and examinations have moved into the virtual world and are going to stay like that. So we should and we have to move in that way. I think, as we would always say, and we talk about it and quite frequently at SESMA, really be really clear with your assessments what it is you want them to do and what it is you want them to achieve. By that I mean, what is it you want to test? Do you just want to test facts and knowledge, or do you want to test what we would call sort of higher order skills? So interpreting facts, reasoning, logic, deduction. What is it you want to test? Because what you want to test in your assessment automatically dictates how those assessments might look in order for you to do that. Because an MCQ cannot test reasoning. It's very, very difficult, but it's very good at testing factual knowledge. And when you then take that forward, you will then discover this sort of world of, I would call it hybrids. So if you just want to do an MCQ, you can just do it all online. You may not want to do it all online, but you could. If you want to do other things like sort of Viva, oral examinations, etc., they are much more difficult to do online, and the very fact you've gone online changes the dynamic and changes how they work, and they might not deliver what they would deliver in a face-to-face environment. And so you kind of have to think of that. Now, nobody quite knows where this will end up by 2025, let's say. But it will end up with a bit of everything, and I think we will be trying to get the best out of everything. Obviously, from our role is to support and guide and help UEMS sections develop, from a strategic perspective, their assessments and examinations, and that's what we want to do. And that's why we, at our recent meeting, we're now frantically working at how do we evolve all these standards, and what is it that's fundamentally stayed the same, and what is it that is fundamentally changing or will change, and how do we reflect that in how we support, guide, and facilitate in SESMA to help everyone to get the quality assessments and examinations to ultimately ensure the patient safety at a pan-European level that we need. So that's my main point.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And then Professor Felice has been most patient. He's had his hand up for the longest. So if we could ask you to turn your mic on and your camera on and ask your question, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The first thing I want to point out is that we're talking of 3 parts of an exam, and indicating that the first part is the MCQ, second part is an oral, third part is a clinical. I think here it's a bit of a mistake, because the oral and the clinical can be taken together. They're essentially the same thing, but still we can have 3 parts. And the first part is one which has been completely overlooked. The first part is the eligibility process. That is a very robust way of assessing competence, because you can do it over time. Naturally, you have to rely on the formative assessments done at a national level. And for that reason, we might have to expand more into accrediting centers to have a surer way of doing it. But even at this stage now, the eligibility process is an extremely important part and should not be ignored. The other comment I wanted to make is about the use of IT, the use of virtual way of conducting the exams. It is true that it is a solution in these circumstances, but we must realize that if we are delivering an examination, a high stakes examination with conferment of fellowships and so on, then we should not take things lightly in this way, because if there are chances and significant chances of examination misconduct, and I would rather use that term rather than using the term fraud or even the term cheating. Fraud is a legal term with serious connotations. In most countries, fraud is punishable with imprisonment. So it shouldn't be used in this context. Cheating is more easily used, but still it ties your hands, because if you finish up in court, you have to prove that the candidate had cheated, which is not the same as saying that he did not behave properly. So if we use examination misconduct as a term, it will be easier to prove, because he just didn't obey the examination rules. And that's it. And that's easy to prove. So basically, I wanted to stress the eligibility process as a very robust way of assessing competence, even though the third part, that is clinical or clinical oral, is also geared to assess competence, but it's much more valid if you do it over a period of time, the whole period of training.
Thanks very much. The next person who has their hand up is Dr. Berg, Jonathan Berg. So if you want to unmute, and I think we can allow you to turn your camera on as well, possibly.
Okay, that's slightly scary because I haven't checked my background.
Don't worry. Just leave it on mic alone, it's fine.
Okay, anyway, good evening. Very welcome to see my kitchen, which is not looking too bad at the moment. Greetings from the section of medical genetics, where we actually can just add that we have just completed our MCQ, which we delivered with CYIM and ProctorU. CYIM contracted with ProctorU, so that turned out to be very satisfactory. And I get a feeling of, to some extent, even the companies are learning by doing through this process. And we only had one candidate who failed to connect, and that is because they got their time zones wrong. The metrics, everything, all the usual process. So we're definitely bonded with an online delivery with MCQs in the future. I was just, I suppose, going to ask, I suspect there may be an economy of scale if we start to work as consortia. And for the MCQs, maybe less of an issue, but for things like running OSCEs, or as we have them, structured oral assessments, which are the same thing, but without real patients within them, this is easy to achieve with something like Zoom. But at the same time, you could imagine there has to be a much more efficient and safer way of doing it. I'd be terrified that I'd be running a Zoom OSCE session and the whole thing would go pear-shaped on me, and we could end up with 24 examiners and 12 candidates completely lost, and the whole thing could be a total write-off for technical reasons. So having partners who can deliver that rather more complex structure of exam, and possibly as a consortium, so that we've got a way of doing it for different sections, to me would be fabulous. Because we basically had to identify our MCQ partner, and Rob actually helped us, and that was great. The OSCE clinical assessments are much harder to see how they will work smoothly online.
Great. Thanks very much. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Can I make a comment, Patrick, about the providers? I think we've had this debate, and Mark, you can interrupt me. We've had this debate in treading a fine line between having the commercial providers make presentations about their, different equipment, if you like, at the SESMA meeting. So what we do at SESMA, we're very specific that in the non-closed meeting, when we're coming up for the break, we will invite various companies to give a presentation. They have 5 minutes. We tell them that we have absolutely no influence in that presentation and that the delegates are free to speak to those companies. Because what's very interesting is that the different providers also can have different attributes that suit one exam better than another. We're always very conscious as well as appearing to have a bias for one company versus the other, simply because they offer different things to different exams. And then in a way, some things can go wrong with an exam delivery, and it doesn't automatically imply that that provider is a poor provider. And I think, as the comment was made, we're all learning a little bit on the hoof. It's how we deal with that learning process and maintaining the art of communication to improve that is important. So I certainly think the comment is well taken, that if we were able to go with a single provider, that may work very well, but a single provider may not meet the requirements of different exams. I don't know if you've got a comment there, Mark, because I think, Patrick, you've gone to such an effort to make this great presentation. We've so many attendees, and I think it is a great opportunity for a wealth of learning for everybody, that not one size fits all.
I'll make a couple of comments. The first thing is there is a very fine balance, and there is a grey zone with the commercial providers. The clue is in the definition. They are commercial providers. They are there ultimately to serve the needs of their shareholders or their own, CEO. That said, we need to work with them because you can't deliver these exams to the high standards. We've heard from Arthur Felice concerns about exam security, and yes, the software is out there. It is quite sophisticated and quite delicate, but it's not something that we as individuals or we as UEMS sections or SESMA are individually going to be able to develop. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just not going to happen. So we have to partner with our commercial providers, but we also have to maintain that distance with them. We have our own interests and objectives, and we need to be clear that the various commercial providers are providing, either contractually or in general what we've asked them to. The other thing that we have instituted at SESMA, and we're quite clear about now, is we have a closed portion of the meeting to which they are not allowed to attend, and they are not allowed to be present at all. And that really is to facilitate some of what Maeve's just alluded to, which is things do go wrong. And actually, whilst it is a catastrophe when an exam just collapses with hundreds of people online all across Europe in front of your face, the one thing that is absolutely critical is the rest of us learn from that and understand what went on and why, and how as a group we could learn from that so that the rest of us hopefully don't have that. And that can involve some quite terse feedback to the commercial or comments about the commercial providers, and it can be commercially sensitive information. And so we have to have a forum in which we as SESMA or UEMS sections can talk about that in a very controlled and safe environment, particularly for the individuals or sections who are presenting, where they have comments that were like, well, this was happened, this isn't what we asked for, this wasn't great, they didn't deliver this. So we have instituted a closed section of the SESMA meetings. We have had presentations which I have to say have been very frank, but they have been exceptionally informative to the members there, and people have commented how useful they've been. So again, this delicate balance, and again, it will evolve, but we do have to actively manage that process, because you can't just have them ever present. That's not appropriate.
Thanks very much. So I think thanks Mark, thanks Maeve. I think if there's no other questions in the chat, I don't see any more hands up. I'm going to round this up because we're going to run it for about an hour. I would just let everybody, and there's a few people who've come in late, don't panic. The whole webinar is recorded and will be available shortly on the UEMS website, as will the presentations be. And we might pop some questions up from the chat. If you want to send anything to contribute to the discussion, or if you have personal experience that you were too shy to contribute, but you want to add some information, you'd be very welcome to send them in, and we'll share those through the UMS website as well.
Patrick, I might say that Professor Giambattista has just texted me as well to say that his entire survey and that presentation, which is incredibly informative, he would be very happy to share that and have that put online. So I will forward that to you as well for inclusion in this.
That's super. Okay, so there's one, Dr. Parigi has just managed to squeeze a hand up quickly before the final bell, so go on ahead.
Thank you, Patrick. No, just thank you, Maeve, for the proposition. I was just only to remember you a thing. Why, when someone is sneezing, you are wishing him God bless you? Why God should bless us just for a sneezing? Or if you prefer in Italian, salute or salud or gesundheit, etc. This is something coming from 1348 in the Black Plague, when the sneezing was the first symptom of something either trivial or something that could have killed you in 5 days. We are still now having the consequence of a pandemic of 7 centuries ago. Therefore, what our president, Vasilios Papalois, said, the future will for sure not be the same. I don't know if this pandemic will go on with this consequence for 7 more centuries. I don't know. I'll not be there. What we can say is whatever has been discussed within SESMA, it is, by the way, I'm the SESMA treasurer, is published on the SESMA website, and therefore we kindly invite you, and I don't know if for privacy we can send you an advertising to the link or whatsoever, but all what has been discussed, specifically the questionnaire with all the details that Maeve presented you today, this evening, or if you wanted the lecture on how the many ways of cheating, and there are really many ways of cheating, also the best prepared proctoring system, etc., etc., etc. All these is a wealth of knowledge that is available on the UMS website, specifically in the section of SESMA. Therefore, my kind invitation, please utilize this wealth of knowledge, because actually the amount of knowledge we are gathering within an organization with representing a little bit short than 2 million medical doctors, professionals throughout Europe, etc., has to be utilized more, has to be known more. And therefore, let's see what will happen in the future, and see you back in 6 to 7 centuries to check what will be the consequence of these pandemics. I hope you are good health.
Thanks very much. Now, although we've run a little bit over time for a webinar, I think it hasn't run a full century yet. So I'll just thank all the contributors. I put the link to SESMA in the chat, and obviously if you're not sure, you can just put SESMA UMS into Google, and at the moment it's still the top link. And I'll just thank everybody for their attendance, particularly the football fans, but if there's any Swedes or Ukrainians who are watching, you need to get away, because I think the match has kicked off at that end. And wish you thanks very much to everybody and for all that you've contributed, and I wish you a good evening. All the best.
Thank you, Patrick.